we will get started. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to September's Learning Community event. Part of the series here today is we're going to be sharing with you updates on low carbohydrate diets. My name is Rina Hisamatsu. Many of you may already know I'm part of the coordinating team at MCT2D, and I also practice in family medicine at Michigan Medicine too. All right, so just a quick overview of what I'll be sharing with you all today. The bulk of my talk is going to be a fundamental overview and review of low carbohydrate eating patterns. And then I would like to also share with you some summaries and key takeaways from the low carb diet patient reported outcomes from one of our previous VBR years, and then some updates in the LCD literature, as well as I'll be addressing some questions that were submitted prior to this learning community event today. All right. And so with that, let's get started. So historically, we have been using measures of blood glucose to help with diagnosis of type 2 diabetes and also to guide treatment decisions, which include, of course, the medication initiation and intensification as well. So we know that the challenge with this approach is that it does not necessarily treat the upstream or root cause of type 2 diabetes, which is often related to obesity or adiposopathy. And so we know that there are over 200 comorbidities associated with obesity, including type 2 diabetes. And these complications affect every organ system in the body. So statistics show that nearly 9 in 10 people with type 2 diabetes have overweight or obesity. And thus this really highlights how these two diseases are closely intertwined, interconnected, and we often cannot have conversations about one without the other. Now, the strongest evidence for type 2 diabetes prevention in the US comes from the Diabetes Prevention Trial, or DPP trial, which demonstrated that intensive lifestyle interventions could reduce the risk of incidence of type 2 diabetes by 58% over 3 years. And one of the main goals of this intervention was to aim for at least a 7% weight loss during the first 6 months of the intervention through dietary change. In this case, for the DPP trial, was focused on low fat and low calorie eating patterns in combination with physical activity goals. Now, we know that weight loss of 5 to 10% can improve glycemia and reduce type 2 diabetes incidence, with greater weight loss being associated with greater glycemic improvement and type 2 diabetes remission. Additionally, weight loss can also extend beyond just type 2 diabetes management and prevention, but also can have positive impacts on physical function, cardiovascular risk reduction, blood pressure control, liver disease, and sleep apnea. Now, today, there are a variety of patient-centered and evidence-informed interventions to help patients work towards their health goals. Some examples include a variety of lifestyle change interventions, anti-obesity medication, bariatric surgery, etc. An important reminder here is the recognition that there are many evidence-based dietary strategies for the management of type 2 diabetes. Once again, we're really shifting away from the paradigm of the one-size-fits-all approach. Now, the most evidence for weight loss and glycemic control in the literature is found in dietary strategies that reduce overall energy intake. So, for example, calorie-restricted eating patterns, or nutrient restriction. So things like low fat and low carbohydrate diets have also been heavily researched. We also see a shift in the language, right? So towards focus on more of an eating pattern that emphasizes key nutrient principles, for example, minimizing ultra-processed foods and emphasizing inclusion of whole foods such as non-starchy vegetables, protein sources, and high-fiber foods. Today, many leading national and international organizations, including the ADA, recognize low carbohydrate eating patterns as a viable lifestyle intervention for managing diabetes. Uh, because low carbohydrate diets are in essence a reduction of a macronutrient, so in this case, reducing total carbohydrate intake, it can be applied to various eating patterns that suit individual preferences. So I think this is where that kind of personalization and tailoring can really come in handy. So for example, a low carbohydrate eating pattern can be applied to Mediterranean diet principles. It can be tailored to individual cultural, religious preferences. It can be, although a little bit harder, can also be applied to vegetarian and vegan diets as well. Now, there is also a strong physiological rationale for carbohydrate restriction. So in the next couple of slides, I'd like to discuss here the relationship to hyperinsulinemia and metabolic syndrome. And I'll come back to this graph again as well. So when we think about the pathophysiology of obesity, there is a lot happening backstage. Um, Backstage, there is an interplay of so many hormones: insulin, leptin, GLP-1, GIP, the microbiome as well, which shapes hunger, satiety, our cravings, how energy is stored, and energy expenditure as well. And so one of the most influential players here is the hormone insulin, and it plays an important role in how it regulates adipose tissue. So this graph that you see here is from one of several studies depicting how insulin levels in patients with metabolic syndrome uh, are higher than those without metabolic syndrome. And just as some information, all participants here ate the same meals at the same time, but you can see here that there are very different responses in insulin. So metabolic syndrome is often described as a cluster of conditions that increase heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and stroke. It is characterized by a number of uh, classic classifications such as abdominal adiposity, high blood pressure and blood glucose, low HDL, and high triglyceride. Another common characteristic of metabolic syndrome is hyperinsulinemia. Now, this slide here is kind of depicting the relationship between insulin and adipose cells. Now, insulin is an anabolic hormone, which means that it inhibits lipolysis and promotes fat storage. And so when we are in a state of high insulin levels or persistent high insulin levels, it can leave the body in an insulin-mediated energy storage mode. And over time, without without the body being able to access the storage, it can lead to hypertrophy of adipose tissue, which over time can lead to dysfunctional fat cells or adiposopathy. And so this slide here is really highlighting the relationship between insulin and energy metabolism and storage. So the rationale here is to then focus on the reversal of this adiposopathy by limiting the frequency of insulin spikes. Now we know that food, especially specifically dietary carbohydrates, is the most potent stimulator of insulin release. And thus, this is one of the modifiable factors that can be helpful in reducing the insulin spikes and reverse the cycle of adiposopathy. All right, and thus by reducing dietary carbohydrate intake, it can help to reduce circulating insulin levels, which promotes the breakdown of stored fat. And this not only facilitates weight loss, but also a reduction in ectopic fat in the liver and the pancreas, which can help to improve insulin secretion from the pancreas and reduce insulin resistance. So ultimately, this can also help to improve overall glycemic control and restore metabolic health. All right, so now let's go into some of the definitions of low carbohydrate eating patterns. So on a standard diet here in the US, people typically will consume an average of 250 to 300 grams of total carbohydrates a day. That's generally greater than about 45% of energy intake. Here we see a table that depicts the various levels of carbohydrate intake. Now, a low carbohydrate diet, the most widely used definitions in the literature will define it as consuming less than 130 grams of total carbohydrates for low carb eating patterns and less than 50 grams of total carbohydrates for very low carbohydrate eating patterns. From here on, I will call the very low carbohydrate diets as VLCDs for short. All right. So when working with patients, in clinic, in the beginning, when building rapport or having initial encounters with patients and having that discussion with lifestyle change and understanding what their health goals are, I try to first sort of better understand what their lifestyle is like. So understanding, what they enjoy eating, what their typical day of eating looks like. And so for some people, we might encourage more of that relative change approach based on what their baseline diet is like in order to support that behavior change process and improve glycemic control. So I often will ask patients, walk me through a typical day of eating. I try to also ask about snacks and beverages, timing of meals, and portions as well. Now, this data can be really helpful to identify, where they might feel ready, right? Kind of addressing what their state of, where their level of change might be. And it can be a great place to kind of just explore with patients and figure out what might be the best recommendation to advise our patients around dietary change that's relative to their current or baseline eating pattern, as well as their taking into account their preferences. So I also think about, what might be some of the key culprits of foods and beverages that might cause elevations or spikes in their blood glucose or insulin levels. These can often be calorie-containing beverages, packaged foods like cereals, granola bars. And so a reasonable starting point might be just to address some of these culprit foods and working with the patient to maybe find lower carb alternatives or healthier alternatives um, there. For some patients, you might work with them on transitioning one meal at a time, like breakfast in this case. There is a lot of growing data suggesting that changing breakfast alone can improve glycemia over the course of the day and reduce glycemic variability. So this could be a helpful strategy for patients who might typically consume a higher carb breakfast and might also be a more approachable recommendation rather than changing 180. So it's kind of a one step at a time approach, can be more feasible. Okay, so this slide here, what I wanted to depict is really that reducing carbohydrates does not necessarily mean restriction. So what you can see here, all of the plates that you see on the slide contain the same amount of carbohydrates. But we can see here that there's actually a lot of variation in terms of the volume and the amount. So from a carbohydrate standpoint, a low carb lifestyle can in turn encourage a larger volume of foods that are naturally low in carbohydrates, but high in fiber and nutrient density. So some examples we see here, non-starchy vegetables, nuts and seeds, berries, and such. All right. The next two parts, I'm going to be talking a little bit more in detail about meal planning around low carb, and then we'll go into very low carb meal planning as well. So when it comes to the meal planning basics for low carb lifestyles, I generally like to share this as a first starting point to build a balanced meal, build a balanced low carb meal using the 4-step process. The 4-step process includes picking a protein, adding your non-starchy vegetables, using fats for flavor and satiety, and then adding in some complex carbs. Now, some some of my the patients that I work with also like to use the ABC um, ABCs of low carb meal planning, which is something that I had learned about from an external resource called Eat the Butter. So both of the resources are here on the slide that I'll share after our session today for you all to reference. But essentially the ABC stands for A for adequate protein, B for bright veggies, C for careful carbs. So some patients really like that kind of ABC approach as well. All right, so the low carb jumpstart, as many of you may already be familiar with, this is one of our um, really sort of one-stop shop of low carb resources for patients. We really love it because it's an interactive website that has really all of the basics. It's got a great sort of starter guide for patients who are interested in learning more about how to transition to a low carb lifestyle. It has a variety of resources like recipes, meal planners, sample meal plans, and then also strategies to keep track and set goals as well. So we recently made updates to the website that I wanted to highlight some of the new features that we have here. So I'm really happy to share with you all that our design team created this wonderful new refresh to the meal planning guide. So now we have this interactive four-step process that users can essentially flip through different options in each of the categories, and many of them will also be attached to a recipe as well. So it's just a really beautifully like visually beautiful tool that I hope many of you can continue to use going forward. All right. And just to kind of reshare with you all that we do have the Jumpstart website is also where we house the blog page, which, we might not have all of the paper tools and resources in our resource library. Sometimes we'll address many of the frequently asked patient questions and respond via a blog post. So the Jumpstart website, this is where all of those frequently asked questions are housed. We have common questions that are asked about uh, shopping low carb on a budget, how to navigate social gatherings and holidays, how to eat low carb on the road, and many more topics as well. Okay, so many of you may not be new to the power of the CGM as an additional tool to support behavior change. I just wanted to highlight here really, how integrating CGMs with nutrition, with dietary and behavior change can be a really powerful tool for our patients. Many of my patients have shared that it's been a game changer to have the ability to uh, see and review real-time feedback of how food impacts their blood glucose. And so it can be really supportive in essentially with low carbohydrate eating patterns as well. So I just wanted to highlight here that there is a free CEU course through the ADA for any clinicians who are new or seasoned in CGM use and interpretation, if they're interested to learn a little bit more about how that can be used to support uh, building healthy dietary habits. I just want to note that the course is currently open, but it will expire at the end of the year. So make sure if you're interested to do it by December 31st. All right, so one of the main things that we can extract from CGM data and download is this AGP report, the ambulatory glucose profile. I really enjoy this because you can essentially modify the period of data extraction. By default, it usually captures 14 days, but you can extend this up to, I believe, 90 days or maybe even more. But it's a helpful tool to kind of give you an overview, a high-level summary of the patient's glucose data. So you can take a look at their average glucose, their time in range, as well as if they're having any episodes of hypoglycemia, percentage of hyperglycemia, daily patterns as well. And the daily patterns, as well as the patterns and trends over time, can be one of the most helpful graphs that I personally use during discussions with my patients, because it can be a helpful way to sort of see trends, and you can identify areas of focus for the discussion, right? So if you're noticing a patient's blood glucose is trending up during certain periods or times of day, like the mid-afternoon or maybe late at night, this could be sort of an opportunity to spark that conversation and working together with your patients to kind of just explore what's going on during that time that's making their blood glucose spike.
Hey, Rena, one question in the chat here.
Oh, sure.
Um,
Thank you.
is there a reason why soy and beans have not been listed as a source of protein in the infographic?
Source of
So, why soy and beans have not been listed as a source of protein?
in my slide, Jake, or sorry, let
Yeah,
me see here.
I think back a little bit before the CGM.
Before the CGM. Is it right here? Or if the person who asked the question can maybe let me know
Good
if there is
afternoon.
a
This is
specific.
Dr. Madhura Mansubdar. And yes, this particular infographic is a beautiful rendition, but just wondering why we've not included lentils, soy, and beans in this.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yes, they definitely are included as part of a protein source. Um, mainly because of the space, we weren't able to include all of the examples of protein containing foods. But certainly soy foods as well as other plant-based protein sources, um, whether it's made from soy like tofu, tempeh, beans, lentils, will be will definitely be part of that protein source. We also, for the four-step process, I generally think of beans and lentils being part of the complex carbohydrates, but they, of course, will have overlap in terms of their nutrient composition.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback. Just wanted to share, there tends to be this misconception that protein is equal to animal products, and that was the reason why I was bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's definitely a really important point, and I think we can definitely include or be more specific and broader about, um, you know, depending on the example of the food listed. Many of these foods may have, especially with plant-based protein sources, they may, uh, you know, contain more than just one of the macronutrients. So. Um, we will definitely include that or think about how to consider how we can maybe make it more inclusive to plant-based protein sources too. So
I
appreciate that
appreciate it.
feedback.
Thank you.
All right. All right, I think we were here. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about very low carbohydrate eating patterns, or VLCDs. And when it comes to very low carbohydrate meal plans, I find that there's still a lot of discussion and debate, right? And in terms of um, clinicians who recommend, or maybe clinicians who use this interventions less often. And so I actually wanted to take a pause here and do a quick poll with everybody on the call today, just to kind of see if there are any, if anyone from the audience, have you ever recommended a very low carbohydrate diet to your patients? So if you can give me one moment, I think you will see a poll pop up. Okay. I'm seeing responses come in. All right. Wow, this is really interesting. I'm seeing almost equal responses throughout. So this is really interesting to see that there is a lot of variation. Um, all right, I will end the poll here. It looks like,
You know what? It's time for lunch. What would you like for lunch?
all right, can everybody see the poll results?
Yes.
All right, yeah. So this is really interesting to see that there is actually a lot of variation. We have 21% of the respondents say that they do regularly recommend this in practice. 32 will sometimes recommend it. 21% they have never recommended but are interested to use this approach. 26% said that they have never recommended this to their patients. So thank you all so much. This is really interesting data. All right. All right. So I'm hoping to, in the next couple of slides here, sort of walk everybody through some of the basics of VLCD meal planning and discuss this in a little further details as well. So when it comes to the meal planning basics, I will usually share this meal planning handout with my patients. It's essentially a 3-step process, very similar to the 4-step that you saw earlier, without the 4th step of the carbs. So essentially picking a protein, adding your non-starchy vegetables, and using fats for flavor and satiety. All right, so the pathophysiology behind VLCDs is in the transition of the body's main fuel source from glucose burning to fat burning by activating what we call nutritional ketosis. And nutritional ketosis is an intentional restriction of dietary carbohydrates to promote ketone production and utilize fats as the primary fuel source. Now, nutritional ketosis is activated when the body's glucose stores are depleted and there is a lack of sufficient dietary carbohydrate intake. And usually that is less than 50 grams of total carbohydrates a day, between 20 and 50. Now, the hallmark of nutritional ketosis is a blood ketone level of about 0.5 to 3 millimole per liter. It should something that I tried to explain here is that it should not be confused with diabetic ketoacidosis, as there are some key differences between these two states. So typically, the range of ketone levels in ketoacidosis is usually 5 to 10-fold greater than the levels that are achieved in nutritional ketosis. And nutritional ketosis, uh, there, there's normal blood glucose levels, and the blood pH is also maintained, as opposed to a highly acidic blood pH that is associated with DKA. So in nutritional ketosis, usually you're aiming for a blood ketone level of about 0.5 to 3 millimole per liter. All right, and also in VLCD meal planning, we usually teach the concept of net carbohydrate counting. So net carbohydrates is defined as the non-fiber grams of carbohydrates in a food. In other words, these are the grams of digestible carbohydrates that affect blood sugar levels. So counting net carbohydrates can be a helpful tool for some patients. They prefer this because it encourages an intake of more fiber-rich foods. So, for example, non-starchy vegetables, nuts and seeds, avocados, and berries. And in practice, I usually recommend, if counting net carbs, to keep it within 20 to 35 grams of net carbs on a VLCD meal plan. All right. And this slide here is a reminder that VLCDs are moderate protein meal plans. In general, the distribution of energy intake on a VLCD is usually, most importantly, the parameters of the low carb. So it's less than 10% from dietary carbohydrates, usually 20 to 30% or less from protein, and 70% or greater from dietary fats. In the literature, there are no explicit calorie goals in VLCD interventions. Patients are generally advised to keep their carbohydrate intake within those parameters and combine with adequate protein, non-starchy vegetables, and adding fats for flavor and satiety. And interestingly, what the studies have found is that these recommendations often result in patients eating to satiety with those recommendations, but overall consuming less calories. All right, so when initiating a VLCD, there may be some potential side effects to be aware of, which may occur within the first few days or weeks of dietary change, but they can often be managed or mitigated through lifestyle. Most importantly, a gradual carb reduction of 1 meal per week is what I often recommend, and then and also reinforcing excellent hydration and liberalizing sodium intake are some of the key steps to ensure minimal side effects. There are potential risks that people may view as universal with VLCDs. However, these risks are usually limited to certain populations. For example, with euglycemic ketoacidosis, this is usually in patients taking an SGLT2 inhibitor. The risk of hypoglycemia is usually associated with patients with type 1 or patients taking glucose-lowering medications like insulin or sulfonylureas. The risk of hypotension is usually associated with patients taking antihypertensive medications, and then also variations in LDL changes.
Rena, another question in the chat from a couple of slides ago.
Yeah.
Since net carbs are not recognized by the FDA or ADA, how are you using this in your practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I typically will, can you maybe, the person who asked the question, maybe elaborate a little bit more on what they mean by that? Okay, I'm seeing Patricia. Since net carbs are not recognized by the FDA, how are you using this in your practice?
Sorry, I was trying to get my mic on. Right, I get a lot of patients that do the look at net carbs, but when you're doing something that a lot of these keto products that are really high in fiber, but they might be a higher carb thing too, they still find elevated blood glucoses after. So I tend to teach more to look for grams of fiber. 3 to 5 is considering a good source, but then that's only if they're looking up whole food products, right? If they're using a lot of processed foods, I try to steer them away from doing those more whole food products. So just wondering how you're using this. And you did kind of explain it a little bit in your presentation. I put that in before you started, so.
Yeah, great question, Patricia. And I completely agree with you. So I try to steer away from very low carb, from eating patterns that are high in processed foods or low carb or keto products that we find a lot nowadays on the market. There is some room for those here and there, but I usually will encourage patients to focus more on whole foods. So tracking the net carbohydrates based on whole foods ingredients. So for example, if they're incorporating avocados, nuts, and seeds, this is where, berries, this is where the net carb calculations can be helpful. Some sources or some practitioners who use net carbohydrate counting will also advocate for example, with the use of sugar alcohols, to subtract just half of that instead of all of those grams of sugar alcohols, because some patients or some individuals may be impacted or may have some glycemic response to sugar alcohols. So I try to steer away from eating patterns that are really high in packaged foods when talking about VLCDs.
Right. Well, and I guess that's my concern is that some companies are including fiber and sugar alcohols. Some companies aren't in that net carb. I think it can be confusing for patients who do eat a lot of packaged foods using that net carb guideline. So,
Right. I agree with you. And I find that too, that can oftentimes be what causes them to also be more costly when we rely on more of those packaged low carb or keto products.
agreed.
All right. So in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. And then if we have time at the end, I will definitely go back to some of these questions. So thank you all. All right. Okay, so briefly, we were talking a little bit about some of the risks associated with VLCDs for certain populations. So really here highlighting the importance of a collaborative approach, working together with your care team, your physicians, APPs, pharmacists, to make sure that medications are reviewed together and any changes, adjustments are made prior to initiation of a VLCD meal plan. There are some references and other helpful guides that I recommend taking a look at and downloading. It can be just a helpful encyclopedia to reference during your practice. This tool has information about ways to adjust for type 2 diabetes medications and blood pressure medications as well for patients who are following a very low carb meal plan. All right. And again, the slide here is depicting an important note to discontinue SGLT2 inhibitors to avoid the rare risk of euglycemic DKA prior to the initiation of VLCD therapy. Typically, euglycemic DKA results from an insulin deficient state and unopposed lipolysis or fat breakdown. So I know that some providers will also check for endogenous insulin production as another safety precaution as well. So that's also something that can be done in practice to ensure to reduce the risk. All right. And now switching gears here, I wanted to share with you, these are some of the outcomes from the key patient-reported outcomes from a low-carb diet quality improvement initiative that we participated in, POs participated in the year 2023. I wanted to provide a quick intro and overview. So in 2023, we had 3 physician organizations select to a focus on a quality improvement initiative related to enhancing low-carb diet education for patients. And as part of this effort, practices distributed patient-reported outcome surveys to individuals who were newly recommended a low-carbohydrate diet. And so they were asked to complete this 6 weeks after attempting this meal plan. And the survey was used to capture their experiences with low carb eating, as well as the education and support that they received from their care team. So the surveys concluded in June of 2024. And at the same time, we also had providers in the practices complete a brief survey about their perceptions of patient challenges related to low carb eating and the tools and resources that they commonly use in practice. So some of the highlights I wanted to share here. One of the key themes that we asked about was in relation to low carb diet resources. So this is not a shocker, but printed handouts were the most widely distributed type of resource in these practices and also the most requested by their patients. So when asked about the top 5 resources that patients received, these are listed here. So they wanted to know about low carb foods or groceries. They wanted to know about what they can substitute, low carb substitutions. This is something I'll talk a little bit more about towards the end. We're in the process of making a tool here. Recipes, so low carb recipes was a top resource, sample meal plans, as well as a carb tracking log. So many of these resources are available on our MCT2D resource library, as well as our Jumpstart homepage as well. Patients were also interested in websites and video resources, according to the survey. So just highlighting here some of the resources we have through the collaborative. So we've got an intro, a 3-part intro to low carb video series for patients who are interested to learn more in a video format. We released a fun collection of low carb cooking demonstrations as well. Both of these are available on the resource library and MCT2D as well as Jumpstart. And then everything is also housed under the Low Carb Jumpstart website, which again is that patient-facing interactive website. Okay, now we kind of look into sort of what patients say are their top challenges versus, what providers hear from patients or maybe perceive as biggest challenges about low carbohydrate eating patterns. So in both, actually, the top challenges that was related to low carb eating patterns from both the physician and patient perspectives was cravings for sweet and starchy foods. Patients also mentioned that their challenge, included difficulty to sustain long term, as well as hard to manage at social gatherings. Providers also mentioned difficulties or challenges to track carbohydrates on a daily basis and difficulty to sustain. Again, many of these challenges we address or we try to address in some of the blog posts that we have on the Jumpstart website, especially when it comes to things like navigating social gatherings or holidays. We have some tips and tricks or strategies that can be helpful to navigate that. Similarly, cooking low carb on a budget, and many more topics. So just wanted to reinforce that of this resource. In terms of future plans and motivations, among those who currently follow or intend to follow a low-carb diet, this was really interesting because 94% of the survey respondents said that they plan to maintain this diet over the long term among those who currently followed it. And those who reported that they were not planning to continue following or maintaining their low-carb lifestyle, their top reasons were, difficult to maintain and missing carbohydrate-containing food or missing carbohydrate-containing foods. For those who selected that they plan to maintain the diet long-term, their top 3 reasons were a desire to improve their overall health, improve their A1C, and to reach their weight loss goals. So I thought these could be maybe helpful tips and helpful to review what patients have been saying about low carbohydrate lifestyles in some of your practices. And hopefully we also are able to review some of those resources that can be helpful in initiating those changes. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some updates in the literature. So actually, I'm really excited to talk a little bit about this. One of the limitations in low-carb diet research is the lack of longitudinal studies. And I was actually excited when I first came across this publication from Virta Health. So they recently published results from their 5-year or outcomes of their 5-year study. This was like a 3-year extension of their original 2-year study. Sorry, a 3-year extension of their original 2-year study. So I wanted to highlight some of the key results and takeaways. So what you can see here is a flow chart of participants in the continuous care intervention from baseline to 5 years. What I wanted to actually highlight here is actually really interestingly, they have really high retention rates across those 5 years. So just to demonstrate and highlight that here. A little bit about the baseline study in the initial year, or in the initial study. Participants with type 2 diabetes and a BMI of greater than 25 were initially enrolled in a 2-year open label, non-randomized trial comparing 2 different care models. So it was a continuous care intervention, or CCI, compared to a usual care intervention. So participants in the CCI who completed the original 2-year study were then invited for a 3-year extension to evaluate effects over 5 years. So a little bit about the intervention itself. So the CCI was a continuous care app with telemedicine through their care team. Initially, participants were advised to consume less than 30 grams of total carbohydrates a day. It was, I think, 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of reference body weight, and fat intake to satiety. Their weight, their blood glucose, ketone levels were also monitored to measure adherence to the nutrition recommendations. And they were given, or they had continuous care and support throughout the intervention, including communication for medication management as well. All right, so some of the key summary of the results. Again, the study assessed the 5-year effects of a continuous care intervention for people with type 2 diabetes. The N was 122 that they assessed at 5 years. Of those, 20% of the 5-year completers with the data achieved diabetes remission, so A1C less than 6.5 with no glucose lowering medication greater than 3 months. And then 32.5% achieved A1C less than 6.5. They were only on metformin. And really interestingly, sustained improvements were noted in BMI, A1C, triglycerides, HDL, inflammatory markers, and there were no significant changes in LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol at 5 years. Okay. So we can see the most significant improvements occurred at 12 months, which are very similar to other studies that I've read, with some regression over time, but still overall a net positive outcome at 5 years. We also see among the 5-year completers, we had 61% and 40% of the participants sustained a 5% and 10% weight loss, respectively. And those who were not in remission at 5 years maintained glycemic control with less medication and sustained about 8% weight reduction as well. There's also, we saw significant, or we can see here, significant reduction in use of diabetes medication at 5 years. Almost 50% of the diabetes medication changes were elimination, 60% if excluding metformin. And just a note here, the metformin was only deprescribed in response to a contraindication or intolerance or participant refusal to continue. So yeah, I think pretty incredible results that they were able to capture at 5 years. Now, some strengths and limitations. The strengths, of course, duration. It was nice to see that there's finally a study that's showing a longer duration. This was a newer continuous care model, and there is also broader applicability for populations that are living with type 2 diabetes. Of course, there are also limitations to the study. The authors noted there was a lack of a comparison group through the 5 years, limitations in racial diversity of the participants, and the data at the 5-year endpoint was extracted during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that may have influenced the results. And these are the some of the main authors' conclusions and takeaways. They concluded that there was significant and sustained reductions in medication need and use, in addition to complete diabetes remission. This is possible with the VLCD intervention. 58% of the participants sustained diabetes remission from 2 through the 5 years. compared to other large randomized trials like the DIRECT trial, which was at 26%. The diabetes remission rates compared quite favorably with other lifestyle therapies which have elicited remission. So in this study, it was 20% achieved remission at 5 years compared to 7.3% at 4 years in the Look Ahead trial, which is a large randomized study, the 13% at 5 years for the DIRECT trial. These were the meal replacement and then the total diet replacement, respectively. And so we can see here that the higher rate of sustained remission in the present study may be due to the sustained carbohydrate restriction and some of the metabolic benefits that are attributed to nutritional ketosis. And also, I think the continuous care model the approach that they used. Now, the fact that it's not a randomized trial may be seen as a weakness or a limitation. But when we actually think about what happens in the real world, I think it's really interesting data, right? Because in the real world, we don't randomly assign patients to an eating pattern to follow. It's a collaborative, patient-centered approach to determine what they prefer and what their health goals are and work towards a care plan that fits their needs. And so we can see, in this study that like individuals who self-select a very low carb eating pattern and enjoy the lifestyle that it offers, we can see in this study that they're able to maintain it in the long term at the 5 years. And we also see sustained biometric outcomes that are comparable, if not exceeding, to other evidence-based strategies. Okay, so last but not least, I received a couple of questions that were submitted prior to this presentation, so I wanted to address this with you all. So one of the questions that was asked was around recommendations for amount of protein and type of dietary fats recommended. Now, in terms of dietary protein intake, I tend to recommend slightly over the RDA, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. I typically consider that to be around the minimum for low carb lifestyles. Usually, many low carb diet clinicians will recommend between 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. We also use adjusted body weight for individuals with overweight or obesity. And this slightly higher protein intake can be supportive during weight loss efforts by helping to maintain muscle mass, as well as increasing satiety and controlling appetite as well. And so generally, as like a general guideline, I typically recommend 75 to 100 grams of protein a day. That's usually about 20 to 25 per meal if they're having 3 meals a day, and then maybe some snacks if that's part of their regular routine of eating. All right. So in terms of types of dietary fats, in general, there are no standardized guidelines for calorie or fat grams on low carbohydrate meal plans. I generally recommend dietary fats to be used to support meal planning, to add flavor or customize flavor preferences, and to help achieve satiety. I often recommend fats that naturally occur in food and have been minimally processed. So that includes monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. We've got olives and olive oil, nuts and seeds of a large variety, avocados and avocado oil, fatty fish, grass-fed, animal products like meat, eggs, and dairy, and then for cooking as well, I typically will encourage olive oil or avocado oil. Okay, last but not least, we also received another question about interest in receiving having a list of low carb food substitutions for patients. Coincidentally, we are working on creating an MCT2D tool on low-carb alternatives to common carbohydrate foods. This right here, this is just some of the snapshot of what we're preparing. There are lots of low-carb alternatives. I like to share with my patients, for example, lower carb root vegetables in place of potatoes, like turnips, daikon radish, jicama, etc., which can be used interchangeably with potatoes, using cauliflower to make a mash, using jicama to make French fries, different ways to have lower carb breads, for example, using a leafy green wrap instead. A lot of recipes nowadays showing you can make a low carb flatbread with cottage cheese and eggs, makes a nice flatbread. You can use portobello mushrooms for a bun, in place of a burger bun, and many more options. Similarly with rice and corn as well, just some ideas here. So, oh, last thing I wanted to share. So a few of my colleagues and I have also been developing a Pinterest board on low carb foods and products. So we have been receiving a lot of interest from our patient population that they wish they had like another sort of one-stop shop where they had different types of low carb foods or products that they see on the market just for ideas and inspiration when they're to help them in the meal planning process. So I have the link here, but I was going to quickly show you what that kind of looks like right now. It's in the process of being built, so we're just adding as we go. So we have a lot of different categories that you don't need to have an account to go through Pinterest. You can essentially just click on this and it might take you to the websites for specific products that you can find at the grocery store and other things. So that is all I have for you all today.
There are a number of questions in the chat if you have time, Rena.
Thank you, Jake. Yes, I've been seeing the light pop up.
And Jane, we will be sending out the slides, yes.
Okay, let's see, where should I start?
The last one that you had not addressed yet was Kelly Wemples. Do you think that some of the LDL increases in it is because people switch to higher fat foods when they limit CHO?
Thank you, Jake. Do you think some of the reason? Yeah, that's a good question. So it could be during like initial transition to a low carb eating pattern, and during initial stages of weight loss, we often see increases in increase or variable changes in lipids. So sometimes we might see an increase in triglyceride levels, and with LDL, some of the theories that some of the theories that have been reported with the LDL changes may be actually due to the type of LDL particles and the density of the LDL particles that may be contributing to the LDL increases. So a couple of studies that I've read have shown that the changes in LDL, there's increases in larger, less dense LDL particles versus the more atherosclerotic dense LDL particles. So that may be one of the contributing factors to seeing the differences in lipid levels. Let's see. Let's see here. Would you avoid very low carb for people with CHF since SGLT2 inhibitors is guideline directed therapy? That is a good question. I'm not sure. I
can kind of help out here a little bit, Rena.
Thank you, Jake.
MCT2D does recommend that low carbohydrate diets, especially very low carbohydrate diets, are not paired with SGLT2 inhibitors in general due to the risk of euglycemic DKA. However, if a patient is not currently on an SGLT2 inhibitor for CHF, and wishes to try a low carbohydrate diet, that could be something that's decided in a shared decision-making process. But once a patient is started on an SGLT2 for congestive heart failure, a low carbohydrate diet would potentially not be right for that patient.
Thank you, Jake. And I wonder, since we are at 1:02, I might copy and paste these questions and respond to the participants who asked after our visit today, in the interest of time here.
That sounds great, Rena. Yeah, if you want to take a screenshot and capture them and reach out to the askers individually.
Yes, I'm
lovely.
actually going to capture these real quick. All righty, everybody. So I've got the questions captured, and I'll be following up with those who asked these questions. Thank you all so much for joining today, and thanks for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and happy weekend.